Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today our topic is, how do I know I am exposed to heavy metals? Heavy metals can appear in our lives because of volcanoes. They can appear because of commercial and industrial poisonings of many, many types. And the way that we find out is usually through history and physical examination and lab tests. History is about 90% of how diagnosis is made in healthcare and medicine, and so that means asking questions about symptoms. A really, really good medical historian, a really good doctor that's very skilled at this will ask questions like, have you had any new symptoms? Have you had any strange symptoms? These symptoms may be skin-related, they may be brain-related, and the types of brain-related symptoms could include things like paresthesia. Paresthesia is a feeling of crawling on your skin, like ants crawling on your skin, or bugs crawling on your skin, or bubbles, like if you've ever felt bubbly water on your skin from carbonated water. That sensation is called paresthesia, and paresthesia means false feeling. So it's not really there. So if you looked at your skin, you'd see nothing's happening, there's no actual ants on your skin, but you have that false feeling. A lot of people call that numbness, and it isn't really numbness. Numbness means you can't feel one of the typical feelings or modalities, we call them, like cold or heat or vibration or 2-point discrimination. How far away are 2 points on your skin? Or light touch, which is like a cotton ball or a tissue. And of course, crude touch and vibration. These are different sensations that a person would feel, and sometimes you can get actual true numbness of body parts from heavy metal toxicity, and sometimes you just get the paresthesia where you feel weird, but when you actually test for sensory loss, you don't have any sensory loss. So it could go either way. You can get mental symptoms and brain symptoms that would include, sometimes feeling like schizophrenic, sometimes feeling like you don't know the difference between reality and fantasy and illusion. Each heavy metal profile is different, and when they work together and you're co-poisoned by more than one, like mercury and lead and aluminum, they work together and they can give you really confusing symptoms. Very generally in humans, the heavy metals poison our enzyme systems, so they make us have unpredictable behaviors chemically. So if you're trying to figure out your response to a vitamin or your response to an herb or your response to a nootropic, whether that be a drug or an herb or a nutraceutical, or your response to regular old minerals, you might not find that you respond the way the textbooks would tell you ought to respond to dosages or times of day or different things that you would expect when you take those substances because of the poisoning of the heavy metals in your cells. In an examination, a doctor might look at your coordination. They might examine your cerebellum, which is in the back of your brain. They might look at your coordination, your tendency to be clumsy, to not be able to do rhythmic things, to be able to know where your body parts are in space and to balance yourself. They would also do motor testing to see if you've lost any strength or you've got any weaknesses. You might have very strange problems that change. Heavy metals can manifest as a sensory problem that then becomes a motor problem, and that sensory problem resolves itself. And so you have these moving targets that can be very, very confusing. So a doctor would do a physical neurological exam. They would listen to your abdomen, they would listen to your heart and lungs, they would probably check out your sinuses and your nerves, they would check your reflexes. As I said, motor, sensory, cerebellum, balance, posture, all that kind of stuff. And as they examine you, they're looking for signs and symptoms. Sometimes there are some things that would happen with the skin and hair and nails. It's not uncommon to get some strange eczemas, and there are many, many, many kinds of eczemas. Eczema is not just one thing, but eczema or atopy or atopic dermatitis, it can be caused by a lot of things. It can be caused by food lectins, it can be caused by allergens, it can be an allergy or not an allergy called a sensitivity, it can be an intolerance of some kind, it can be a toxic burden, it can be a clearance of toxins through your skin that doesn't have anything to do with allergy. Sometimes it can be autoimmune, and even heavy metals can sometimes trigger autoimmune disease in patients that already have genes for that. We'll be talking about that in another lecture about genes. So when it comes time to look at some of the sources of those heavy metals, we might see them in pesticides, we might see them in herbicides, we might see them in chemtrails. They've been identified in chemtrails. They've been identified in toxic fertilizer. There's a toxic, fraudulent fertilizer network in the United States that's working to basically take industrial waste and relabel it fertilizer and feed it back to you in the soil. So you've got to watch out for toxic fertilizer. There have been many books written about this and stories written about this. Also volatile organic compounds, which are basically solvents, things like paint thinner and benzene and gasoline and all kinds of things that dissolve stuff. petroleum-based products mostly. Your garden can be exposed. You'll also get some toxic heavy metals in the adjuvants that are in some vaccines. It's quite a bit of different metals like aluminum and mercury and some other things that can show up in these adjuvants. So what are the lab tests that a person might get? Well, if you go to your medical doctor and you say, I've been poisoned by heavy metals, they're probably going to pull blood and they're going to look at your blood. They're going to look at an array of different heavy metals, several of them between, half a dozen to more than a dozen. And they're going to look at the heavy metals and they're going to tell you that you either have or don't have an excess amount in your blood. There is some normal amount of heavy metals in people's bodies because we do accumulate heavy metals and we do void them and clear them, and different people have different biochemical individuality, which means that they may clear heavy metals less efficiently or more efficiently than other people. So be aware that if you're exposed to stress or deficiencies or toxins, you might be better or worse at clearing metals. And further, some people are actual metal hoarders, and they tend to, not consciously of course, but unconsciously, they tend to hoard these metals inside their cells, inside their tissues, inside their bodies, so they don't give them up. So they might have actually less amounts of metals than we would suspect compared to the general population. So those people might be harder to clear, and they often tend to be people that have more tendencies toward autism and toward Alzheimer's and other types of difficulties that we see. So your doctor may suggest an intravenous chelation push test, which is where they put a drug into your veins, and that drug is a drug that will bind to certain metals and pull them out of your tissues and make you pee them out. And so that would be a urine test that's done with an IV medication that's done by prescription. And there are several different drugs that can be used for several different things to measure how much is coming out of your urine. That's a popular test, and it can be very useful, especially if you've got some problems that aren't explained. The difficulty with the chelation push test is that sometimes the push or the pull effect of mobilizing all these heavy metals out of your cells might move them into more nervous system tissue. It might move them from your bone into, say, your brain, or move them from your liver into your spinal cord or your peripheral nerves, and that could be worse. So you have to be careful that if you're an unstable patient, meaning you've got unstable neurological symptoms, unstable brain symptoms, or other types of immune system symptoms, that you might not want to undergo chelation push if your heavy metals are found in your hair. Now, if your heavy metals are found in your blood, you meet the criteria for an acute poisoning, and your doctor's probably going to say, yeah, we got to do this, and I wouldn't be against that idea because it's a risk benefit. You've got acute poisoning. It usually only lasts in your blood for about 9 weeks after a commercial industrial exposure, and then your body kind of shoves it away into other organs. Now, I've talked before about this, and acute exposure, mostly what we know about heavy metals comes from the mining and mineral industry because of exposures of workers. And so we know that people breathe this in, they drink it in with water inadvertently, they breathe it in, they ingest it, they eat it, and they get it on their skin and they absorb it through their skin. So these are the ways that people get heavy metals in commercial exposure. So most of you that are doing chronic stuff, that are looking at chronic illness, are probably not going to have heavy metals in your blood. You're probably going to have heavy metals in your hair, which is a good measure of the last 4 months, the last 120 days of time that your hair has been growing and pushing heavy metals out of your roots and making them into your hair and getting rid of them slowly. You can also measure it in your fingernails, but not many labs do that. So you can measure fingernails, you can measure hair. There are some labs that will measure sweat, not very many. But the most common way that we measure heavy metal exposure is the hair. There are tests that are very useful of heavy metals in the urine and the stool. And when I order them together because I'm trying to figure out in a patient if they're clearing too much or too little out of the bile and poop method or the kidney and urine method. Because sometimes they can have one more than the other and they're not as efficient, or they're too efficient in clearing out one system versus the other of clearance. And I need to say a last word about Alzheimer's and autism. Aluminum is not technically a heavy metal, but it is something that shows up in hair. It isn't terribly accurate, but Dr. Christopher Exley found that aluminum was high in the brains of most people and animals that had Alzheimer-like conditions and autism-like conditions. That doesn't mean that it's the only cause, and it doesn't mean that vaccines are the cause of Alzheimer's or autism. It simply means that wherever aluminum is found, which happens to be in adjuvants in vaccines, it can end up in the brain, and it can make people who have a genetic tendency toward autism or toward Alzheimer's be more symptomatic and more difficult. And there are ways to get rid of that and clear that out, but there's not great ways to test for it. So just realize that that the higher source of aluminum is actually from antacids. It's not from vaccines, it's from antacids, although there are some from vaccines. So you'll find aluminum in other sources too. It's in chemtrails, it's in pesticides, it's in herbicides, it's driven into the brain, across the blood-brain barrier by glyphosate, and aluminum and other heavy metals are driven across the blood-brain barrier, which is normally quite tight and resistant, by electromagnetic fields, especially those that vary and that have a pulsed nature to them. Pulsed electromagnetic fields, which are like our phones, those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about that vary. They're not constant and steady, they vary and they have pulses, and they give packets of information and then they stop, and then they give packets of information and receive them and they stop. So that means smart meters, electric smart meters, that means cell phones, that means your router, your computer, your laptop, your tablets. Try and get those things away from your bodies and your brains during the day and during the nighttime when you're sleeping. And clock radios, all that kind of stuff. Electronic devices often have ungrounded and dirty electricity flowing through them, and that can be a problem for your heavy metals.